I didn't know his name when I chose to stand in front of him. I just remember thinking that if I didn't move, something irreversible would happen and I wouldn't be able to live with myself. It was 2:13 a.m. and the diner smelled like burnt coffee and syrup that had been sitting too long under heat lamps. My feet ached from a double shift, and my hands trembled slightly as I balanced a tray of plates, the kind of exhaustion that makes everything feel distant and slow, until he walked in and the entire room seemed to hold its breath without knowing why. He didn't look around like normal customers, didn't check a menu or his phone. He just stood there for half a second too long, like he was measuring the space, calculating something invisible. Then he chose a booth in the far corner where the light flickered just enough to hide details. I told myself he was just another late-night customer, maybe a businessman, maybe someone who couldn't sleep, but something about the way people instinctively gave him space without understanding why made my skin prickle. I poured his coffee and noticed his hands first, steady, controlled. Not the kind that fidget or hesitate. He didn't thank me, didn't smile, just looked at me like he was memorizing my face for a reason I couldn't explain, and for a second I forgot how tired I was. Forgot the stack of unpaid bills sitting on my kitchen counter. Forgot everything except the strange, heavy silence that followed him. I should have walked away, should have stayed behind the counter where things were predictable and safe. But I didn't, because right then the front door opened again, and this time the air changed completely, colder somehow. Sharper, like the moment before a storm breaks. 3 men stepped inside wearing expressions that didn't belong in a place that sold pancakes for $6.99. Their eyes scanned the room too quickly, too deliberately, and I felt it in my chest before I understood it in my head. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. I glanced back at the man in the corner, and for the first time he moved fast, not panicked, not surprised, just precise, like this was something he had expected all along. His eyes met mine, and in that split second there was a warning there, silent but unmistakable. Leave, get down, run. I don't know why I didn't listen, maybe because I've spent my whole life trying to do the right thing even when it costs me. Maybe because I saw the way one of the men shifted his stance and realized they weren't here for coffee or conversation. They were here for him, and somehow that mattered more than my own safety. Everything that happened next blurred into fragments. A sharp sound, the tray slipping from my hands, his arm reaching out too late, and then heat spreading through my side like something had been torn open. The world tilted, and I remember thinking this can't be real. This can't be happening in a place with neon signs and sticky floors. But when I hit the ground, he was already there, holding me steady, his voice low and controlled as if nothing around us could touch him. "Stay with me," he said. And it wasn't a request, it was a command. And that was the moment I realized I hadn't just protected a stranger. I had stepped into a world I didn't understand, and there was no way back. The first thing I noticed when I opened my eyes was the silence, not the peaceful kind but the heavy kind, that presses against your chest and makes you aware of every breath you take, the kind of silence that does not belong in a world where something has already gone wrong. The ceiling above me was smooth and white, too clean, too perfect, and for a second I thought I was still dreaming until the faint scent of antiseptic mixed with something expensive and unfamiliar grounded me in reality. My body felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. Every movement slow and careful, and when I tried to sit up, a sharp ache pulled me back down, not overwhelming but enough to remind me that whatever had happened was real, painfully real. I turned my head slightly and saw the room around me. It was not a hospital the way I knew it. There were no crowded hallways or buzzing machines or voices calling out orders. Just quiet, controlled space with soft lighting and furniture that looked like it belonged in a luxury hotel rather than a medical facility. And that was when memory started to return in fragments. The diner, the late hour, the man in the corner, the moment everything shifted. My breath caught as I tried to piece it together, and then I heard it, a voice low and steady coming from somewhere to my right. "You should not be awake yet," he said, and I did not need to look to know it was him. I could feel his presence before my eyes even found him, sitting in a chair near the window, like he had been there the entire time, watching, waiting, unchanged, his posture relaxed but controlled, his gaze fixed on me in a way that made it impossible to look away. "Where am I?" I managed, my voice weaker than I expected, but steady enough to carry the question. He did not answer immediately, just studied me like he was deciding how much truth I could handle, somewhere safe. He said finally, and something about the way he said safe made the word feel different, heavier, like it came with conditions I did not understand. I swallowed and tried again. What happened? And this time there was a flicker of something in his eyes, not guilt, not regret, something sharper, something that felt like responsibility. You were in the wrong place at the wrong time, he replied. But even as he said it, I knew it was not the full truth, because I remembered the way he had moved, the way those men had looked at him, not like a stranger, but like a target. No, I said quietly, shaking my head despite the discomfort. They were not there for me. And for the first time since I woke up, his expression shifted, just slightly, enough to tell me I had crossed into something real, something dangerous. He leaned forward then, resting his elbows on his knees, closing the distance between us without ever actually touching me. You should not ask questions you are not ready to hear answers to, he said, and his voice was calm but carried an edge that made my pulse quicken, not out of fear exactly, but out of the realization that whatever world he came from was far bigger than I had imagined. I should have backed off, should have accepted the vague answers and focused on recovering, but that has never been who I am. You said I am safe, I replied, meeting his gaze despite everything in me telling me to look away. So tell me the truth. And for a long moment he just watched me, measuring, weighing, like he had done the first time we met. And then he exhaled slowly, the smallest crack in his control. You stepped into something that does not let people walk away, he said, and the words settled between us heavier than anything else. I felt it then, not just the pain in my side or the confusion in my mind, but the shift, the point where my life had quietly split into before and after. And you, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Who are you? The room seemed to hold its breath again, just like the diner had. And this time when he answered, there was no hesitation, no distance, just quiet certainty. The man you chose to protect, he said, his eyes never leaving mine. And the reason you are still alive. And something in the way he said it told me that was only the beginning of the truth I was not ready for. I should have been afraid of him, but what I felt instead was something far more dangerous, because it was not fear that kept my eyes locked on his. It was curiosity mixed with a quiet defiance that I could not explain even to myself. The room felt smaller the longer he stayed silent, like the air was adjusting to him instead of the other way around. I shifted slightly against the pillows, trying to ignore the pull in my side, and the way my body still felt, like it had not caught up with my mind. That is not an answer, I said, my voice steadier now. And for a brief second something almost like amusement touched his expression before disappearing, just as quickly. It is the only one you need right now, he replied, calm as ever, but there was weight behind his words, like every sentence carried layers I could not yet see. I let out a slow breath and looked away from him for the first time since I woke up, taking in the room again, the polished surfaces, the quiet hum of unseen machines, the absence of chaos that should have been there after everything that happened. This is not a normal hospital, I said, more to myself than to him. And I heard the faintest shift of fabric as he leaned back in his chair. No, he answered simply. It is not. And that confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Nothing about this situation was normal. Not the place, not the silence, not the man who spoke like he controlled more than just the room we were in. I turned back to him slowly, my mind catching up piece by piece. Those men, I started, choosing my words carefully. They were not surprised to see you. And this time he did not respond immediately. His gaze sharpened just slightly, enough to make my pulse pick up again, not out of panic, but out of the realization that I was getting closer to something real. People who come looking for me rarely are, he said. Finally, and there it was. Not a full truth, but enough of one to change everything. I felt it settle in my chest heavier than before, the understanding that I had not just helped a stranger in trouble, I had stepped directly into someone else's war without knowing it. So they were looking for you, I said quietly, and he did not deny it, did not soften it, just let the truth exist between us. Yes, he said, and that single word carried more weight than any explanation could have. I swallowed, my thoughts racing. Now, Connecting moments I had not understood before. The way he had entered the diner, the way the room had changed, the way those men had moved. None of it had been random. None of it had been coincidence. And the realization made my chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with pain. Then I was not in the wrong place, I said, almost to myself, and his eyes narrowed slightly, studying me again like he was seeing something new. No, he said slowly. You were exactly where you chose to be. And something about that made my breath catch, because it meant this was not just bad luck or timing. It was a choice I had made in a single moment that had altered everything. I looked down at my hands resting against the blanket, steady now despite everything, and tried to understand why I had done it, why I had stepped forward instead of back, why I had ignored every instinct that should have told me to run. I did not think, I admitted softly. I just moved. And when I looked back up at him, there was something different in his expression, something quieter, less guarded. That is why you are still here, he said, and I frowned slightly, not understanding. What does that mean? I asked, and this time he stood, moving toward the window for a moment, before turning back to face me, the distance between us changing in a way that felt deliberate, controlled. It means, he said, his voice lower now, more direct, that most people would have walked away. He paused, then, just long enough for the weight of his words to settle. But you did not. And the way he said it made it feel like that mattered more than anything else that had happened that night, more than the place we were in or the danger I had stepped into. It felt like the beginning of something I could not yet see. And for the first time since I woke up, I realized the truth that had been building quietly in the background. I was not just recovering from what happened. I was being pulled deeper into it, and whether I wanted to admit it or not, a part of me was already too far in to turn back. The longer I stayed in that room, the more I realized it was not built for recovery, it was built for control. Everything was quiet not because nothing was happening, but because everything was already handled before it could reach me. I shifted again, trying to sit up straighter this time, refusing to let the lingering weakness define how I faced him. If they were looking for you, then they will come back, I said, the thought settling heavily in my chest. And for the first time since this conversation began, I saw something close to agreement in his eyes. Not concern, not fear, just acknowledgement. They will try, he replied, and the way he said try made it clear that whatever force stood behind him was not easily challenged. I let that sink in for a moment before asking the question that had been forming since I woke up. Then why am I still here? I gestured slightly around the room. Why not send me home? The word home felt distant. As soon as I said it, like it belonged to a version of my life that was already slipping away. He did not answer right away, and that silence was more telling than anything else he had said so far. He walked a few steps closer, stopping just at the edge of the bed, not invading my space, but not giving me distance either. Because you are not safe there, he said, finally, and the certainty in his voice made my stomach tighten. I have lived in that apartment for 3 years. I pushed back. Nothing like this has ever happened. And even as I said it, I knew how weak it sounded compared to everything else unfolding around me. He watched me carefully, like he was deciding how much to reveal. Nothing like this has ever happened because you were never connected to me, he said. And there it was again, that quiet shift of reality, the line between my world and his becoming impossible to ignore. I looked down at my hands again, thinking about my small kitchen, my late rent notices, my routine that suddenly felt fragile. So now I am a problem, I said, the words coming out sharper than I intended. And for a brief second something changed in his expression, not offense, not anger, but something quieter, almost like correction. No, he said firmly. Now you are a responsibility. And that word landed differently than I expected, heavier in a way that made it hard to dismiss. I frowned slightly, meeting his gaze again. I did not ask for that, I said, and this time there was no hesitation in his response. I know, he replied, his voice steady but lower now. But you made a choice, and choices have consequences. I exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of that truth settle in, whether I liked it or not. He was right. I had chosen to step forward. I had chosen not to walk away, and now everything that came after belonged to that moment. The room felt quieter again as that realization took hold. Not empty silence, but the kind that follows When something important has been said and cannot be taken back, I leaned back against the pillows, letting the exhaustion finally catch up with me. But my mind refused to slow down. What happens next? I asked, my voice softer now, not because I was afraid, but because I understood that whatever came next was not something I could control. He studied me for a long moment before answering, like he was measuring not just my words, but my resolve. You recover, he said simply, and then you decide whether you walk away or stay. I blinked slightly at that, expecting something more final, something that left no choice at all. You would let me leave? I asked, unable to hide the doubt in my voice, and for the first time since I met him, there was a pause long enough to matter. His gaze held mine unwavering, and when he spoke again, there was something different beneath the control, something that felt almost personal. If you can, he said, and that was the moment everything shifted again, because it was not a restriction, it was a warning, not about him, but about the world I had stepped into. I swallowed slowly, realizing that leaving might not be as simple as walking out a door. And if I stay? I asked quietly, and this time his answer came without hesitation. Then you do not face it alone, he said, and the way he said it made something in my chest tighten, not with fear, but with the unfamiliar weight of being seen as more than just someone who made a mistake, more than just someone who happened to be in the wrong place. I looked at him, then really looked at him beyond the calm exterior, beyond the control and power, and for the first time I saw something else. Beneath it all, something that did not belong to the world he came from, something human, and that realization was far more unsettling than anything else, because it meant this was not just about survival anymore. It was about a choice I had not realized I was already starting to make. Sleep did not come easily after that conversation. It hovered just out of reach, like my mind refused to let go of the reality that had shifted beneath me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw fragments of the diner, the flicker of lights, the way everything had changed in a single second, and every time I opened them again, I was still here in a place that felt too controlled to be temporary. I turned my head slightly toward the window and noticed the city beyond it for the first time, distant, lights stretching out in neat lines, quiet from this height, like the world below had no idea what existed above it. You are thinking too much. His voice broke through the silence again, calm but observant, and I realized he had not left, not even for a moment. That is what happens when nothing makes sense, I replied, my voice softer now, but no less certain. He did not respond immediately, just shifted his position slightly, like he was considering something. It will make sense eventually, he said, and there was something about the way he said eventually that told me this was not a short story I had stepped into. This was something that would unfold piece by piece, whether I was ready or not. I let out a quiet breath and pushed myself up a little more, ignoring the pull in my side this time. A nurse had checked the dressing before dawn and warned me not to move too fast, and I hated how clearly my body was proving her right. You said I can leave, I said, testing the words. Again, so when? And this time his answer came slower, more deliberate. When you are strong enough, he replied, and I frowned slightly, because that was not just about physical recovery. I could hear it in the way he spoke. Strong enough for what? I asked, and he held my gaze without hesitation. To understand what leaving means, he said, and that answer settled heavier than I expected, because it implied that leaving would not simply return me to the life I had before. It would mean carrying something with me, something I could not ignore. I looked away again, focusing on the small details in the room, trying to ground myself. The faint reflection on the polished table, the quiet rhythm of my own breathing, anything to slow the thoughts racing through my head. My job, I said suddenly, the thought hitting me out of nowhere. I did not show up. They are going to replace me. And for the first time, something almost like confusion crossed his face, as if the idea of something so ordinary did not quite fit into the world he lived in. That is what you were worried about, he said, not dismissive, just genuinely curious. It is what I know, I replied, meeting his gaze again. It is my life. The words sounded small compared to bullets and bodyguards, but they were still mine, and saying them out loud reminded me how much I hated being reduced to a patient in someone else's locked room. And there it was again, that quiet shift in his expression. The moment where he recognized the difference between us, not as distance, but as something real, something that mattered. Your life has changed, he said simply, and I felt the truth of that settle deep whether I wanted to accept it or not. That does not mean I stop being who I am. I pushed back, and this time there was no hesitation in his response. No, he said, his voice steady but firm. It means who you are will be tested. And something about the way he said that made my chest tighten because it was not a threat. It was a certainty. I sat with that for a moment, letting the weight of it sink in, before asking the question that had been building quietly beneath everything else. Why are you still here? I asked, my voice low but clear. You said I am safe. You have people for that. So why you? And for the first time since this all began, he did not answer right away. The silence stretching just long enough to matter. He looked at me, then not like he was analyzing, not like he was calculating, but like he was deciding something that could not be undone. Because I do not leave things unfinished, he said, finally. But there was something beneath that answer, something unspoken that lingered in the space between us. I studied him carefully this time, trying to see past the control, past the power, to whatever it was. He was not saying, I am not a thing, I said quietly, and his expression shifted again just slightly enough to tell me I had reached something real. No, he agreed, his voice lower, now more direct. You are not. And the way he said it made it clear that whatever this was, it was no longer just about obligation or responsibility. It was becoming something else, something neither of us had planned. I leaned back slowly, letting the exhaustion finally pull at me again. But this time my mind did not fight it as hard, because one thing had become clear in a way nothing else had. I had stepped into his world by choice, even if I did not understand it at the time, and now that I was here, the real question was not whether I could leave, it was whether I actually wanted to. Morning arrived without warning, the kind of quiet shift where the light changes before you realize time has passed, and for a moment I forgot where I was. The ceiling above me unfamiliar, the air too still, until memory settled back in like a weight I could not shake. I turned my head toward the window and saw the city again, brighter now, alive in a way that felt distant from where I lay, like I was watching a life I no longer belonged to. You are awake. His voice came from the same place as before, steady, controlled, like nothing in his world ever moved without his permission, and I wondered if he had slept at all, or if he had stayed there the entire night, just watching. I think I am starting to understand that you do not leave, I said, my voice rough but clearer than before, and for the first time there was a pause before he responded, just long enough to make me feel like my words had landed somewhere real. I leave when it is necessary, he said. But something about the way he said necessary made it clear that he did not consider this situation one of those times. I pushed myself up a little more this time, ignoring the lingering ache as I swung my legs slightly over the edge of the bed, testing the ground beneath me like I needed to prove something to myself. You said I need to be strong enough, I continued, glancing at him briefly before focusing on the floor. So I am not staying here forever. And there it was again, that shift in the air between us, not tension, not conflict, but something quieter, something that felt like a line being drawn. He stood, then moving closer, but not stopping me, just observing, always observing. No, he said simply, you are not. And I felt a small sense of relief at that, even if I did not fully understand why. I placed my weight carefully on my feet and steadied myself against the edge of the bed, the room tilting slightly before settling again. Then a sharp pull burned through my side, hard enough to steal the breath from my lungs. Black spots flickered at the edges of my vision, and his hand closed around my arm before my knees could give out. At the same time, I heard a muted crackle from somewhere beyond the glass door, an earpiece or radio, a quiet reminder that even my weakest moment in this room did not happen unwatched, and I let out a slow breath. Good, I said softly, more to myself than to him. But the moment was short-lived, because even as I stood there I realized something else, something I had not wanted to admit before. Leaving did not feel as simple as it should. The thought of walking out of this place back into my old life felt distant, like trying to step into a version of myself that no longer fit. Something is wrong, he said quietly, and I realized he was watching me, not with concern but with precision, like he could see the exact moment my thoughts shifted. "Nothing is wrong," I replied quickly, too quickly, and he did not challenge it directly, just stepped a little closer. Close enough that I could feel the difference in the space between us. "You are hesitating," he said, not as a question but as a fact, and I shook my head slightly, even though I knew he was right. "I am thinking," I corrected, meeting his gaze again, and for a second neither of us spoke, the silence stretching but not breaking, until I finally said the thing I had been trying to avoid. "If I leave, they will still know about me." And there it was, the truth laid out clearly between us. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, just real. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted slightly, like he had been waiting for me to reach that point on my own. "Yes," he said, and there was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to make it easier to accept, just the truth. I let out a quiet breath, feeling the weight of that settle deeper than anything else so far. "So I do not just go back to my life," I said, more to myself than to him. And he nodded once, a small movement, but enough to confirm everything I already understood. "Your life is still yours," he said, "but it will not be the same." And something about that made my chest tighten, not with fear, but with the realization that I was standing at the edge of something I could not step away from without consequence. I looked at him again, this time not as a stranger, not as someone I had accidentally helped, but as the center of everything that had changed. "And you," I said quietly, "you are part of that now." And for the first time since I met him, there was no distance in his response, no careful choice of words, just quiet certainty. "Yes," he said, and the way he said it made it clear that this was not temporary, not something that would fade once I walked out of this room. It was permanent in a way I was only just beginning to understand. I swallowed slowly, realizing that the choice in front of me was not as simple as staying or leaving. It was about deciding who I was going to become now that the line between my world and his no longer existed. The realization did not come all at once. It settled slowly, like a quiet shift in the air that you only notice when it is already too late to ignore. I stood there for a moment longer than necessary, my hand still resting against the edge of the bed, feeling the steady rhythm of my own breathing as I tried to understand what staying or leaving actually meant now. "Then I need to know," I said finally, lifting my gaze to meet his. "If I stay, I am not just hiding here, am I?" My voice was calm, but there was something beneath it, a need for clarity that I could not push aside anymore. He watched me carefully, not surprised by the question, almost like he had been waiting for it. "No," he said, and the simplicity of that answer made everything sharper, more real. "Then what am I doing?" I asked, and this time there was no hesitation in his response. "You adapt," he said, and the word felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than just adjustment, like it meant learning something entirely new. I frowned slightly, shifting my weight more evenly now, as my body adjusted to standing again. "Adapt to what?" I pressed, and he stepped closer, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. "To a world that does not give second chances to those who hesitate," he said, and the way he spoke was not threatening, it was matter of fact, like he was describing gravity or time, something that simply existed whether you accepted it or not. I let that settle for a moment, my mind moving quickly through everything I had seen and felt since that night, the precision, the control, the absence of chaos where chaos should have been. "You make it sound like there is only one way to survive," I said quietly, and he held my gaze without flinching. "There is," he replied, and something in my chest tightened, not because I believed him completely, but because part of me knew he was not entirely wrong. I looked away for a second, toward the window again, the city below continuing without pause, people moving through their lives unaware of how quickly everything could change, unaware of how close I had come to losing everything I thought I understood. "I did not choose this," I said softly, more to myself than to him, and there was a brief silence before he responded. "No," he agreed, "but you chose what you did in that moment." And there it was again, that reminder that everything came. "I expect you to survive," he said, and the simplicity of it made it hit harder than anything else he had said so far. I studied him for a moment, trying to understand if there was more behind. That expectation, something unspoken, but all I saw was certainty. That is all? I asked, and for a brief second there was something else. There's something that flickered beneath the surface before he controlled it again. For now, he said, and those two words carried more weight than any long explanation could have. I let out a slow breath, realizing that whatever this was, it was not temporary. It was not something that would end when I walked out of this room, or even when I decided what to do next. It was something that would follow me whether I wanted it to or not. I shifted my stance, slightly more confident now, as my body adjusted and my mind caught up with the reality in front of me. Then I need to learn, I said quietly, and this time there was no hesitation, no doubt. Just a decision forming in real time. He nodded once, a small movement, but enough to acknowledge the shift between us. You will, he said, and the certainty in his voice made something settle inside me, not comfort, not reassurance, but something steadier, something grounded. I looked at him one more time before turning my attention back to the room, to the space that no longer felt like a place I was trapped in, but a place I was choosing to understand. And in that moment, I realized the truth. I had been circling around since I woke up. I was not just caught in his world anymore. I was stepping into it willingly, and that made everything far more dangerous than before. The decision did not feel dramatic the way I thought it would. There was no sudden rush of clarity or fear, just a quiet shift inside me, like something had settled into place without asking for permission. I took a slow breath and straightened slightly, testing not just my balance, but the weight of what I had just accepted. And when I looked at him again, it was different this time, not as someone trying to understand what was happening, but as someone preparing to face it. And start with the truth, I said, my voice steady even if everything else felt uncertain. Not the version you think I can handle, the real one. He watched me for a long moment, longer than before, like he was measuring whether I meant it or if this was just another reaction that would fade once reality set in. The truth has consequences, he said finally, and there was no warning in his tone, just a statement of fact. I nodded once, not backing down. So does ignorance, I replied. And something in his expression shifted again, not softened, not weakened, just adjusted, like he had reached a conclusion about me that he had not fully accepted until now. He turned slightly, walking a few steps away toward the window, before speaking again. My name is Adrian Volkov, he said, and even though I had expected something like that, hearing it out loud made everything more concrete, more real. And people look for me because of what I control, he continued, his voice calm but carrying a weight that did not need explanation. He still did not give me names, territories, or numbers, and I understood that omission for what it was. Even now, trust in his world was measured out in careful pieces, never handed over all at once. I stayed quiet, letting him speak this time, because I could feel it. This was not information he gave freely. The men in the diner were not there by accident, he added, and you were not meant to be part of that situation. I let out a slow breath, processing each word carefully, not interrupting, not reacting too quickly, because I understood now that every detail mattered. But I said quietly, and he turned back toward me, his gaze direct. Yes, he said, and there was no denial, no attempt to minimize it, just the truth. I stepped forward slightly, now more stable than before, closing some of the distance between us, not out of challenge, but because it felt necessary. So what exactly did I step into? I asked, and this time he did not deflect or redirect. He met my gaze fully. A structure built on power and loyalty, he said, one that does not tolerate unpredictability. And I almost let out a quiet laugh at that, because if there was one thing I had proven already, it was that I was exactly that, unpredictable. I shook my head slightly, more to ground myself than anything else. And now I am part of it, I said, not as a question but as a realization. He studied me carefully again, and this time there was something new beneath his control, something closer to acknowledgement. You are connected to it, he corrected, which makes you visible. And that word hit harder than anything else. Visible meant seen, tracked, known. It meant I could not just disappear back into my old life unnoticed. I felt the weight of that settle deeper than before, but instead of stepping back from it, I held on to it. Then teach me how not to be a weakness, I said, and this time there was no hesitation in my voice, no doubt. just a clear decision. He did not respond immediately, and for a second I thought I had pushed too far, asked for something he would not give, but then he nodded once, slow and deliberate. That depends on you, he said, because strength in this world is not just about what you do. It is about what you refuse to become. And that caught me off guard because it was not what I expected, not a list of rules or instructions, but something deeper, something that forced me to look inward instead of outward. I held his gaze for a moment longer, letting that sink in before asking the one question that mattered more than anything else right now. And if I fail? I said quietly, and for the first time since he had started speaking, there was no distance in his response, no calculated tone, just something direct and unfiltered. Then I will not let you, he said. And the certainty in his voice made something shift again, not around me, but inside me, because it was not a promise of control, it was a promise of protection, and that was far more dangerous than anything else I had heard so far. His words did not leave room for doubt. They settled into the space between us, like something permanent, something that could not be taken back or redefined later. And for a moment I did not respond, because I was trying to understand what it meant to have someone like him say something like that without hesitation. You do not even know me, I said. Finally, my voice quieter now, but steady, and he did not look away, did not soften his expression. I know enough, he replied, and that answer should have unsettled me more than it did. But instead it made something in my chest tighten in a way I could not explain. I shook my head slightly as if that could clear the feeling away. You saw one moment, I continued, one decision, and I took a small step closer without realizing it. That does not define who I am. And this time he moved to, not closing the distance completely, but enough that the space between us felt intentional. It defines what you are capable of, he said, and there was something in his voice that made it impossible to dismiss, something grounded in certainty rather than assumption. I let out a slow breath, trying to steady my thoughts, because this was not a conversation I had ever imagined having, not with someone like him, not in a place like this. And what exactly do you think I am capable of? I asked, and for a brief second there was silence, not empty, but measured, like he was choosing his words carefully for the first time. Surviving something that would break most people, he said, and that answer caught me off guard, because it was not about strength in the way I expected, not about fighting or control, but about endurance, about not falling apart when everything shifted. I looked down for a moment, letting that settle, because part of me recognized it as true even if I had never put it into words before. I had spent years holding things together quietly, working long hours, managing bills, pushing through exhaustion without expecting anything more than stability. And now that stability was gone, replaced by something far more uncertain. I lifted my gaze again, meeting his eyes with a clarity that had not been there before. Surviving is not enough, I said, and the words felt heavier as soon as I said them, because they carried more meaning than I had planned. Then what is? He asked, and there was no challenge in his tone, just a genuine question, and that was what made it harder to answer. I hesitated for a second, not because I did not know, but because I was realizing it as I spoke, choosing who I am in the middle of it. I said quietly, and for the first time since this all began, there was a shift in him that I could not fully define, not control, not calculation, just something that looked almost like respect. He nodded once slowly, like he had reached a conclusion that confirmed something he had already suspected. That is the only thing that matters, he said, and the simplicity of it made everything else fall into place in a way that felt both grounding and unsettling at the same time. I glanced toward the window again, the city stretching out below us, unchanged and yet completely different from the way I had seen it before. Then I need to know more, I said, turning back to him. Not just about this world, but about what comes next. And this time there was no hesitation in his response. What comes next depends on how quickly you learn, he said, and there was a subtle shift in his tone, now not distant, not detached, but something closer to direct involvement, like he was no longer just observing the situation but actively shaping it. I felt that change immediately, and it made my pulse pick up, not out of fear, but out of awareness. This was the moment where things moved forward, whether I was ready or not. Then do not hold back, I said, and my voice was steady in a way that surprised even me. If I am part of this, then I need to understand all of it. He watched me for a long second, and then stepped back, just slightly, creating space again, but this time it did not feel like distance, it felt like preparation. There are rules, he said, and the word carried weight in a way that made it clear. These were not suggestions or guidelines, but something far more absolute. Not written, not spoken openly, but they exist, and they determine everything. I listened carefully, every part of my focus shifting toward what he was saying because I knew this mattered. This was the foundation of everything I had stepped into. The first rule, he continued, is that trust is never given freely. And I felt that settle immediately because it explained more than anything else had so far. The distance, the control, the way he observed everything before acting. Then why are you telling me this? I asked quietly. And this time there was no pause, no hesitation, just a direct answer that landed with more impact than anything else he had said. Because you already earned it, he said. And in that moment I realized the truth I had been circling around since the beginning. That single choice I made in the diner had done more than change my circumstances. It had changed the way he saw me, and that was something far more powerful than I had been prepared for. The word trust did not feel like something I had earned. It felt like something far too heavy to carry after a single moment, and yet the way he said it made it impossible to question. I held his gaze, trying to understand what it meant in his world, because I knew it was not the same as mine. You are giving me something that people like you do not give easily, I said quietly, and there was no accusation in my voice, just a need to understand the weight of it. He did not deny it, did not deflect, just inclined his head slightly in acknowledgement. That is why it matters, he replied, and the simplicity of his answer made it clear that in his world actions were never separated from consequences. I let out a slow breath, feeling the gravity of that settle into place, because it meant everything moving forward would be shaped by this moment, whether I fully understood it or not. Then tell me the rest, I said, my voice steady again, and this time there was no hesitation in his response. The second rule, he began, is that visibility is vulnerability, and I felt that immediately because I had already experienced it without knowing what to call it. The way everything had shifted the moment I became connected to him. If people know who you are and where you stand, they will use it, he continued, and there was no exaggeration in his tone, just a calm certainty that made it more real. I nodded slowly, taking that in because it explained why I was here, why I had not been sent back to my apartment, as if nothing had changed. So I disappear, I said, testing the idea out loud, and he shook his head slightly. No, he corrected. You become intentional, and that difference felt important even if I did not fully grasp it yet. There is a difference between hiding and choosing what others see, he added, and I found myself focusing on that because it was something I could understand, something I could apply. I had spent years managing what people saw of me, keeping things controlled, simple, predictable. But this was different. This required awareness on a level I had never needed before. And the third rule, he continued, and something in his voice shifted just slightly enough to make me pay even closer attention, is that loyalty is not proven through words, he said. It is proven through what you protect when it costs you something. And that hit deeper than anything else because I had already lived that rule without knowing it existed. I had stepped forward without thinking, without calculating the cost, and now I was standing in the aftermath of that decision. I looked at him carefully this time, seeing not just the man in front of me, but the structure he had described, the rules he lived by, the way everything connected. That is why you trusted me, I said, and it was not a question anymore, just a realization. He nodded once, his gaze steady. Yes, he confirmed, and for a moment neither of us spoke. The silence settling in a way that felt different now, not uncertain, not fragile, just grounded. I shifted slightly, adjusting my stance as my body continued to regain strength, but this time it felt more like reclaiming control than testing limits. Then what happens when those rules conflict? I asked, because I could already see it, the way trust and visibility and loyalty could collide in ways that forced impossible choices. He watched me for a moment longer than usual, and I could tell by the slight narrowing of his eyes that this was not a simple question. Then you choose what defines you, he said, finally, and that answer did not resolve anything. It made everything more complex, but it also made it clearer that there would not always be a right answer, only a decision that shaped who I became. I let that settle for a moment before speaking again. And you, I said quietly, which one do you choose? And this time there was a pause that felt different from the others, not hesitation, not calculation, just something heavier, something that carried more weight than anything else he had said so far. When he spoke, his voice was steady, but there was something beneath it, something that did not need to be explained. I choose what I protect, he said, and the way he said it made it clear that it was not just a principle, it was a foundation, something that guided every decision he made. I held his gaze, feeling the impact of that statement more than I expected, because it was not just about him. It was about what he was telling me without saying it directly, that I had already become part of that equation, whether I wanted to admit it or not. I swallowed slowly, realizing that this was no longer just about learning his world, it was about understanding my place in it. And for the first time since this began, I felt something shift inside me, not uncertainty, not hesitation, but something steadier, something that felt like acceptance of the path I was already walking. His answer did not feel like the end of a conversation. It felt like the beginning of something I could not walk away from, even if I tried. And for a moment, I just stood there, letting the weight of it settle fully into place, the realization that I was no longer observing his world from the outside, but standing inside it with him. Then I need to see it, I said, finally, my voice quieter now, but more certain than it had been at any point before. And he did not look surprised by that, did not question it, just watched me like he had been expecting this exact moment. You already have, he replied, and I shook my head slightly, because that was not what I meant. No, I said, meeting his gaze directly. I saw fragments, pieces that I did not understand. I need to see what it really is. And this time there was a pause long enough to matter. Not hesitation, but consideration, like he was deciding how far to let me go. You think seeing it will make it easier, he said, and there was no judgment in his tone, just a quiet observation. I exhaled slowly and shook my head again. No, I admitted. I think it will make it real. And for the first time since this all began, something in his expression shifted in a way I could not ignore, not soften, not weaken, but something closer to recognition, like he understood exactly what I meant, because he had once stood in the same place. He took a step closer then, closing the distance just enough that I could feel the presence of him in a way that went beyond words. Reality does not wait for you to be ready, he said, his voice lower, now more direct, and I nodded, because I already knew that. I had lived it the moment everything changed. Neither do I replied, and this time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, just a decision that had already been made, whether I realized it or not. He studied me for a moment longer before speaking again. Then you start with understanding what you represent now, he said, and I felt my focus sharpen immediately, because this was different. This was not about his world alone. It was about my place in it. You are not just someone who was in the wrong place, he continued. You are someone who chose to act when it mattered, and I felt that truth settle deeper than before, because it was no longer just a memory, it was becoming part of how I was seen, and that changes how people respond to you, he added, and I frowned slightly because I could see where this was going, but I needed to hear it fully. How? I asked, and he did not look away. Some will see you as a weakness, he said, something that can be used to reach me, and there was no emotion in his tone, just fact. Others will see you as something to respect, he continued, because you did what most would not, and I let that settle, because it meant I was not invisible anymore, not in the way I had been before. I had spent years blending into the background, unnoticed, unremarkable, safe, and now that had changed in a way I could not reverse. So either way I am exposed, I said quietly, and he nodded once. Yes, he confirmed, and for a moment I let that reality sit with me fully without trying to push it away or minimize it, because this was the truth I had asked for, and now I had it. Then I choose how I am seen, I said, after a second, and this time there was no doubt in my voice. He watched me carefully, and I could see the shift again, the way he adjusted his understanding of me with each decision I made. That is the only control you have, he said, and something about that made it feel less overwhelming, not easier, but clearer. I took a slow breath and stepped forward slightly, closing the gap between us not out of impulse, but intention. Then show me, I said. And this time there was no hesitation, no questioning, just a direct request for what came next. The silence that followed was different from the others, not uncertain, not heavy, but charged with something that felt like movement, like everything up until now had been preparation for this exact moment. He held my gaze for a long second, before nodding once. Not yet, he said, and for the first time I felt a flicker of frustration, because I had expected something else, something immediate. But before I could respond, he continued, "You are not ready to step outside this space without understanding one more thing." And I stilled slightly, recognizing the shift in his tone, the way it carried more weight than before. "What?" I asked, and this time his answer came without delay. "Once you leave this room, there is no separation between your world and mine," he said, and the certainty in his voice made my breath catch just slightly. "Everything you do, every place you go, every choice you make will exist within that reality," he added, and I felt the full impact of that settle in a way nothing else had so far, because this was not theoretical, this was permanent. I held his gaze, letting that truth anchor itself, before I responded. "Then I do not step outside until I am ready to carry that," I said, and for the first time there was something in his expression that looked almost like approval, subtle but unmistakable. "Good," he said quietly, and the way he said it made it clear that this was not just about survival anymore, it was about transformation. And whether I had planned it or not, I was already in the middle of it. The silence after his approval did not feel empty, it felt like a threshold, like something invisible had shifted into place, and all that remained was the step forward. I stayed where I was for a moment longer, letting that realization settle fully, because I understood now that nothing from this point on would be accidental. Every movement, every word, every decision would carry weight in a way I had never experienced before. "Then I need to know how to carry it," I said, finally, my voice steady but lower, now grounded in something deeper than before. He did not respond immediately, just watched me, like he was measuring not my words, but the intention behind them. "You already started," he said after a moment, and I frowned slightly because it did not feel that simple. Nothing about this felt simple. "Standing here is not the same as knowing what to do," I replied, and he nodded once, acknowledging the difference. "No," he agreed, "but it is the difference between reacting and deciding." And that made me pause, because he was right. Everything up until now had been reaction, instinct, impulse, survival. But this was something else. This was a deliberate step into something unknown. I let out a slow breath and shifted my stance, slightly more grounded, now more aware of my body and the space around me. "Then what do I decide first?" I asked, and this time there was no hesitation in his answer. "What you will not compromise," he said, and the weight of that landed immediately, because it was not about learning rules, it was about defining limits. I held his gaze, thinking through that question, not in theory but in reality, because I knew whatever I said next mattered. "I will not become someone I do not recognize," I said, finally, and there was no doubt in my voice when I said it. It was not a reaction, it was a decision. He watched me carefully, and for a brief second there was something in his expression that looked almost like approval again, but deeper this time, more settled. "Then hold on to that," he said, "because everything else will try to take it from you." And I believed him, not because of the way he said it, but because of everything I had already seen. I nodded slowly, letting that anchor itself in place, because it felt like the first real piece of control I had in all of this. "And what about you?" I asked, the question coming before I had time to filter it. "What do you not compromise?" And this time the pause that followed was different, heavier, more deliberate. He looked at me for a long moment before answering, and when he did, his voice was quieter, but more certain than anything else he had said so far. "What I protect," he said, and there it was again, that same answer, but this time it felt deeper, more defined. I studied him carefully, realizing that for him, that line was not flexible, it was absolute. And something about that made everything clearer. The way he moved, the way he spoke, the way he stayed. It all traced back to that single principle. I glanced toward the door, then something I had not done before, not because I had not noticed it, but because I had not considered it an option until now. It stood there quiet and solid, like it had been waiting for this moment, just as much as everything else had. If I walk through that, I said slowly, turning back to him, there is no going back to before. And it was not a question anymore. Just a statement of fact. He did not soften it, did not try to make it easier. No, he said, and the certainty in his voice made the reality settle completely. I took a slow breath, feeling the weight of that decision not as pressure but as clarity, because for the first time since this all began I understood exactly what was in front of me. I looked at him again, not as someone who had pulled me into this, but as someone who was standing at the same edge. Then when I leave, I said quietly, I am not leaving this behind, I am stepping into it. And this time there was no hesitation, no pause, just a direct response. Yes, he said. And the way he said it made it feel less like a warning and more like a confirmation. I let out a breath I did not realize I had been holding, and for a moment everything stilled, not because nothing was happening, but because everything had aligned into a single clear path. I took one step toward the door, then stopped, not out of doubt, but because I understood now that readiness was not about feeling prepared, it was about accepting what came next. I turned back to him one last time and met his gaze fully. Then I am not waiting for it to happen to me anymore, I said, my voice steady, grounded in the decision I had just made. I choose to walk into it. And for the first time since this began, there was no distance between us, no unspoken barrier, just a shared understanding that this was the moment everything changed, not because of circumstance, but because of choice. The moment I stepped forward, everything became sharper, not louder, not faster, just clearer, like the world had been slightly out of focus. Until now, and this was the second it corrected itself. My hand reached the door before I even realized I had closed the distance. The surface cooled beneath my fingers, grounding me in a way nothing else had since this began. I paused there, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness, because I understood now that this was not just a physical step, it was a decision that would echo long after the door opened. Once you do this, his voice came from behind me, calm and steady as always. There is no version of your life that exists without it. I did not turn around right away. I let his words settle fully because I had asked for the truth, and this was it in its simplest form. I know, I replied quietly, and I meant it more than anything I had said so far. I had spent the last hours trying to understand where the line was between my world and his, and now I knew there was none. Not anymore. I turned, then meeting his gaze one last time, before everything shifted. Then do not hold back, I said, and this time there was no uncertainty, no hesitation, just a clear expectation. He studied me for a moment longer, like he was confirming something final, and then he nodded once, not dramatic, not exaggerated, just enough to mark the moment. I do not, he said, and something in his tone made it clear that he never had. I exhaled slowly, feeling something settle inside me, not fear, not doubt, but something steadier, something that felt like acceptance. And then I opened the door. The hallway beyond was exactly what I should have expected, and nothing like I was prepared for. Quiet, controlled, every detail precise, from the lighting to the distance between each door, like everything had been designed with intention. People moved through it with purpose, not rushed, not distracted, just aware. And when they saw him behind me, there was a subtle shift, not obvious, not spoken, but unmistakable. Respect, deference, recognition of something that did not need to be explained. I stepped out fully into that space, feeling the difference immediately, not just around me, but within me, because I was no longer observing it from behind a barrier. I was standing inside it. Stay close, he said. And it was not a command that demanded obedience, it was a statement of fact that I understood without question. I nodded once, matching his pace as he moved forward. And for the first time I noticed the rhythm of it, the way nothing around him was random, the way every movement had purpose. We walked in silence for a few moments, and I let myself take it in, not just the space, but the structure behind it, the way everything connected. They know who you are, I said quietly, not looking at him, but knowing he would hear it. He did not slow down, did not change his pace. They know who I am, he corrected, and that distinction mattered more than I expected. I absorbed that for a second before responding. And now they know I am with you, I added, and this time he glanced at me briefly, not surprised, not concerned, just acknowledging the truth of it. Yes, he said, and that single word carried more weight than anything else. I felt it settle again, deeper this time, Because this was not theory anymore, this was reality in motion. We reached the end of the hallway, where the space opened slightly into something larger, and I stopped for just a second, not because I could not continue, but because I needed to take in what stood in front of me. This was his world, not hidden, not